With football season upon us now, there's a lot happening in the news, so be sure to subscribe to my other channel, JG9 News, where I give you up-to-the-minute updates on everything happening in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, and I give my thoughts on everything taking place around the National Football League today. And now, on with our feature presentation. This man right here is Minnesota Vikings quarterback Tommy Kramer, and all things considered, he was a fairly solid quarterback. He had the almost impossible task of replacing Hall of Famer Fran Tarkenton. And while no one in their right mind is saying that the first-round pick of the 1977 NFL Draft was as good as Tarkenton was, you can't deny the fact that Kramer was a good quarterback under center for the Vikings for a long period of time. He guided the team to the postseason a ton throughout the 1980s. He finished inside the top 10 in the league in passing yards 5 times. He finished inside the top 10 in the league in passing touchdowns 5 times. And he finished inside the top 6 in completions 5 times. He wasn't in that top tier of quarterbacks by any means, but the man could play football when he was able to stay healthy. However, if you had to point to what was undoubtedly the best season of his career, you would say that it was this season right here that you've been watching this whole time, the 1986 campaign. Kramer was finally able to stay healthy for a full season, and he put on an absolute clinic. In 1986, Kramer ended the season by throwing 24 touchdowns on just 10 interceptions, a stark contrast from 1985, where he led the league in interceptions thrown. His 24 touchdowns ranked 3rd in the entire NFL, only behind Dan Marino of the Miami Dolphins and Ken O'Brien of the New York Jets, meaning that Kramer led the entire NFC in passing touchdowns. Additionally, Kramer finished the season with a passer rating of 92.6, which was the #1 total in the NFL, as no quarterback had a higher rating than he did. During one game against the Green Bay Packers, Kramer had what might have been the greatest performance by any quarterback in Viking history, and I do not say that lightly, as in a 42-7 win, he threw 6 touchdown passes and no interceptions. And for Kramer's efforts, not only was he named an AP second-team All-Pro, but for the first and for the only time in his career, he was named a Pro Bowler, representing the NFC in the All-Star Game. In 1986, Tommy Kramer was really good and had a lot of great moments. Alright, this is a bit of a different setup just because we're talking about Tommy Kramer. I might as well show off this Tommy Kramer autographed jersey, but if you do like learning more about the weird and wacky moments in the history of the NFL, like Tommy Kramer's great 1986 season, then this is the place for you because we talk about all things NFL history all the time on this channel. So if you like that sort of stuff, then be sure to hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We are trying to get to 70,000 subscribers and build the best football community on the platform. So hit that like button down below and subscribe and help us reach that goal. Thanks in advance for your support. Having said that, the 1986 season was definitely not a perfect season for Tommy Kramer by any means. It had its ups for sure, but it also had its downs. And if the game in Week 4 against the Green Bay Packers, where he threw 6 touchdown passes, was the biggest high, then the following week against the Chicago Bears was the biggest low. Because imagine being the quarterback of an NFL team, being the leader, and being the man that everyone looks up to, and publicly putting your defense on blast by saying that they stink and that they don't know how to play football, even though said defense is one of the best in the league. In other words, imagine if a defender on the Chiefs right now publicly called out Patrick Mahomes for being a bad quarterback. That would sound really freaking stupid, right? Well, Tommy Kramer did just that prior to a game against the Chicago Bears. And the reason why? Let's just say that this story takes a twist that you might not see coming. I'll put it that way. Because this is the story behind Tommy Kramer, one of the dumbest moments of his career, and the bizarre drama of the 1986 Minnesota Vikings. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and just how bizarre it was, we need some context to understand the game that led up to the moment. It's October 5th, 1986. It's Week 5 of the NFL season, and we find ourselves at Soldier Field up in the Windy City for this NFC Central rivalry game between the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings. This is a massive game, and not just because it's the national early game of the CBS doubleheader, so most of the country was getting this one. Rather, this game had massive implications on the standings, as 1/4 of the way into the season, both the Vikings and the Bears were looking like some of the best teams in football. Chicago was picking up right where they left off after winning Super Bowl 20 the year before, as they were 4-0 and atop the NFC Central. However, Minnesota, in their first season under new head coach Jerry Burns, was 3-1, just one game behind and looking like one of the best teams in the league. Anytime you have a matchup in October where the two teams have a combined winning percentage of 87%, you know it's a big one. The winner of this game took first place in the division for the moment. If the Bears won, they'd have a 2-game lead, plus they'd have the head-to-head tiebreaker over the Vikings. While if the Vikings won, they'd have the lead with the head-to-head tiebreaker. There was a lot on the line in this game. And a big reason why the Vikings were even in this spot in the first place was because of this unit right here, their outstanding defense. Minnesota's defense wasn't that good in 1985, as they finished in the bottom half of the league in points allowed and yards allowed. Heck, there was one particular game in 1985 where the Vikings put up 35 points and they still lost. That's how bad their defense was. But in 1986, with a new head coach in charge and a new defensive coordinator in charge in Floyd Peters, everything changed. 4 weeks into the season, and the Vikings had allowed a grand total of 37 points. That's it. Barely over 9 points per game. They allowed 13 in Week 1 against the Lions, 10 in Week 2 against the Buccaneers, 7 in Week 3 against the Steelers, and 7 in Week 4 against the Packers. There was not one game in their first 4 where the Vikings allowed more than a touchdown. To sum up the Vikings defense in one word, 1/4 of the way through the year, it was dominant. Simply dominant. And just to give you an idea of how good Minnesota's defense was through the first 4 weeks, here's a look at every single team in the NFL and their points allowed 1/4 of the way into the season. The San Francisco 49ers are in second place, having allowed 56 points through 4 games, or 14 points per game. The Chicago Bears, as in the reigning Super Bowl champion, who many thought had an even better defense in 1986 than they had in 1985, they were in third place with 60 points, or 15 points per game. But that bar way at the bottom, that looks like a one-story building compared to the other skyscrapers, that's the Minnesota Vikings with 37 points. They were in a league of their own to start things off, and the defense was playing lights out. So it would be really stupid for this man right here to, I don't know, completely criticize the Vikings defense for playing like crap, right? The Vikings defense has been the furthest thing from bad. So to criticize your own defense and bash your teammates when they happen to be playing some really good football and you're 3-1 because of them seems like a really dumb idea and seems like the complete opposite of what a quarterback and what a good teammate should do. Especially because any quarterback worth a darn would kill to have a defense as good as the 86 Vikings 1/4 of the way into the season, where all you have to do is manage the game and not turn it over, and you're basically guaranteed a victory. But leading up to the all-important game against the Chicago Bears, in an interview with a Chicago radio station, WLS, Vikings quarterback Tommy Kramer had some choice words for his defensive unit, saying that they were not as good as the numbers indicated, and that, in no uncertain terms, they were a bad unit. Said Kramer on his defense, which, may I remind you, was number 1 in football, allowed 7 points the week before, and had not allowed a single touchdown in the second half of any game thus far. The Bears have an excellent defense. We're just trying to get by up here. Our defense is not as good as all the rest of the teams in the league. We're just hoping to get by with what we got. Seriously. Tommy Kramer, the quarterback of the Vikings just put his own defense on blast by saying that they weren't good, that they were awful compared to the Bears, and in essence, that the unit was put together in a cave with a bunch of scraps. It seemed as though he bashed the front office and the defense in one swoop, which is almost impressive to do. It's always good when you enter a game and you say that you hope to get by because the other side of the ball just flat out sucks. And he was not being sarcastic in this, and it just didn't translate. No, he meant this. I could go on and on about why the quote from this man right here is completely asinine, completely disrespectful, completely wrong, and the exact opposite of what a leader and what a quarterback should do and say. But we can all read. We all have eyes and we can see the quote. I'd just be stating the obvious. Simply put, on the surface, Tommy Kramer was a moron for saying this, and a horrible teammate. The quote seems so absurd considering the circumstances that you would think it's an imposter and someone pretending to be Tommy Kramer on a Chicago radio station. Heck, I've done videos on imposter situations before, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And the interview took the hosts of the radio show on WLS, Fred Winston and Liz Grobstein, aback so much that they thought it was an imposter. They thought they were getting their leg pulled. It got to the point where, as the interview progressed, Winston and Grobstein changed their questions just to make sure that they weren't being prank called, because, let's be honest, no sane quarterback would be dumb enough to say this about his own defense, which is ranked number 1 in football by a healthy margin. Said Grobstein, we have Mike Tomczak and Gary Fensick on 5 times a week. Somebody impersonated Tomczak, and it took me about 30 seconds to recognize that it wasn't him. My first thought was the hotline we gave Kramer. Maybe it was a bogus guy calling to impersonate Kramer. Alas, it was not. It was the real Tommy Kramer. Throw that theory out the window. It was the real deal. Grobstein and Winston asked Kramer questions like where he went to college and where the Vikings practiced, just to make sure that it wasn't some impersonator. Said Grobstein, I knew it was Rice. I wanted to see if he knew. But he got all the answers right to those questions that he would know, but an impersonator probably wouldn't know. This was the real Tommy Kramer. So when word got out and the interview spread like wildfire, and everyone found out that Tommy Kramer just put his own defense on blast for no reason, it was obviously a very bad look for Kramer. Which raises the question, how could he possibly defend the interview? How could he possibly defend those comments and redeem himself? Let's be honest, an apology wasn't going to cut it. Not when you say something that no quarterback would say while he was awake and was conscious. Except, Kramer wasn't awake. He did the interview in his sleep. He was sleep talking. Seriously. Because after the news spread about Kramer's interview, Tommy Kramer said, wait, I did that interview? I said that? Because as it turned out, he was asleep. Here's the situation. Kramer had a daughter, Cassie, who was 2 years old at the time. Kramer was trying to get a good night of sleep, but unfortunately for him, his daughter was sick. So he was up all night taking care of her and dealing with her sickness and her coughs and whatnot. If you've ever been a parent to a sick child, you know how this is. The interview with WLS was being conducted at 8:30 a.m., which usually would be no problem for Kramer. He'd be alert and up and on with his day by that point, and he'd be giving answers that actually, made sense and would lead to a good conversation. But because Kramer had a long day on Thursday, getting ready for the game against the Bears and being at the facility, and then couldn't get any sleep that night and was exhausted dealing with a sick kid, he was conducting this interview with WLS in his bed while half asleep. You ever have those moments where you're working on something, then you blink and it's 30 minutes later? Heck, I've worked while half asleep too. There have been plenty of times where I'm working on my computer for a script for one of these videos, and I close my eyes for a second, and all of a sudden, I have 3 new tabs on my computer open, and I'm clicking random things, and I have no idea how I got to that point. And I realized that I was asleep the whole time. It's a universal feeling. Said Kramer on the interview, I was dead asleep. I don't remember what they asked. I was tired. And this wasn't some excuse by Kramer, because other parts of the interview seemed to back up the fact that he had no idea what he was saying and had no idea what was going on. One of the interviewers asked Kramer what it was like getting ready for the Bears with Jerry Burns in charge compared to Les Steckel in 1984, or compared to Bud Grant in 1985, or any other year that Grant was in charge. It's a good question, and a chance to dive into the philosophy to some extent, and talk about how each coach prepares you for this game. But Kramer gave an answer that just didn't seem to answer the question at all. Said Kramer, "It's about the same. We're all coming in here to play against the Bears." That answer doesn't even make any sense. That answer is something that would not be said by anyone who understands the question. And that answer makes it seem like, in his mind, Steckel, Grant, and Burns are all currently coaching the Vikings at the same time. Adding more fuel to the fire, during the interview, Grobstein said to Kramer, "You sound half asleep. Did we wake you up?" And as Kramer responded, "Just about. You just about woke me up." And if that wasn't enough, Kramer ended the interview by saying, "I'm going to sleep right now. I'm going to bed again." So if there was ever a time where a teammate put another teammate on blast for no reason and actually had a valid excuse for saying something stupid, it was Tommy Kramer. I am 100% giving Kramer a pass on this one. He very clearly was not awake and was not in the right mindset, and quite literally did this interview while he was sleeping. When he said that he didn't remember a single thing that happened in the interview, and when his excuse was, "I don't remember saying that," for maybe the first time in the history of this channel, and maybe the only time in the history of this channel, I am 100% buying what Tommy Kramer is selling. He was dealing with a sick infant. He was exhausted, and he answered a phone while half asleep and just said some crap that vaguely answered the questions, thinking that he was doing something, when he was in no way whatsoever alert. Never have I related to an NFL player more in my life than Tommy Kramer in October of 1986. Grobstein said afterwards that it sounded like Kramer was tired, which, is the understatement of the century right there. And Vikings Public Relations Director Merrill Swanson said on the interview Gone Wrong, from what he said, it was like he was talking in his sleep. It happens to a lot of people. You say to them, "Are you awake?" And they say, "Oh yeah." And then they roll over and go back to sleep. And that's just what happened here. Kramer was abruptly woken up after getting whatever little sleep he got following an all-nighter taking care of his kid. He talked for a bit while he was half dreaming, then put the phone down and crashed again. It's a universal feeling that just so happened to happen to one of the top quarterbacks in football at the worst possible time. And unfortunately for Kramer, this was a pretty bad omen for how this game against Chicago would actually go later in the week. Credit the Chicago defense, credit the lack of good sleep in the build-up to the game due to needing to take care of a sick infant, but whatever the case, the Vikings got shut out, losing 23-0 as Kramer put on an absolute stinker. Kramer finished the game going 11 for 30, completing just 36% of his passes for 163 yards, or 112 net passing yards if you include the 7 sacks he took, no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 27.5, which is worse than if you did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. For some perspective on just how bad Tommy Kramer looked in this game right here, here's a look at the 13 games that Kramer started during the 1986 season, and his passer rating in all of them. His second worst rating came against the Green Bay Packers in Week 14, where he finished with a 67.6. That bar all the way at the bottom that looks as though it's by a completely different quarterback, that bar that feels like it would come from one of the worst quarterbacks in football and not an AP second-team All-Pro, yep, that was the Chicago game. This entire game was ugly with a capital U. From the game itself to the build-up to the game with the interview gone wrong while half asleep, this was a week that Tommy Kramer would like to forget. fortunately for Kramer, after the game between these two teams behind me right here, 2 weeks later, Tommy Kramer would get his revenge on the Chicago Bears, as he would throw 2 touchdown passes in a win against the Bears when they met in Minnesota, and he finished that game with a passer rating that was a hair under 147, a stark contrast to the rating he had in Week 5. So considering the circumstances, I'm going to chalk up that Week 5 game against Chicago as a massive fluke, because again, he was working on no sleep whatsoever. And from what I can tell, Tommy Kramer did not bash his defense during any other game, including the Week 7 game against the Bears, or any game during the 1986 season besides the Week 5 matchup. So while I would say that Kramer learned from his mistakes, I don't think there were any mistakes to learn from. I don't think he made a mistake. I can't blame a guy for saying something while he's asleep. Tommy Kramer was a very good quarterback, and not too many people can deny that. But this might have been the worst moment of his career, considering the circumstances. I guess the moral of the story here is that sometimes people say absolutely crazy and ridiculous things in their sleep. Sometimes people will talk in their sleep with their brain shut off and will say things that make no logical sense whatsoever. It doesn't mean that they mean those things, or they think that these things are true. Your body does weird things when it's sleeping. Because while the Vikings-Bears game in Week 5 was a snooze fest, the interview before the game by Tommy Kramer was also, quite literally, a snooze fest. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.